technical hiccup that we had there, but we're all here now and we're raring to go. So I have the deep pleasure this morning of interviewing Gemma Milne. Gemma Milne is a science and technology journalist covering all things deep tech, including biotech, advanced computing, space, energy and innovation and academia, for titles such as Forbes, The Times, BBC and Quartz. She's the author of Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It, which is out now and it's what we're going to be talking about today. She's also the co-host of the Science Disrupt podcast. She's an expert advisor for the European Commission and Innovate UK, a scout for Backed VC, an innovation jury member for South by Southwest, and a World Economic Forum Global Shaper. Wow, that is quite a CV. Gemma, thank you for doing this for us this morning.
No worries. Thanks for having me. I just need to live up to this introduction now.
So I want to say, first of all, that this is an absolutely fantastic book. I've absolutely loved it. And I'm not somebody that has a science background or a technology background. So I want to say that to the viewers as well. If you don't, then this is very, very accessible. But in no way does it dumb anything down. That's the opposite of what you're going for, isn't it, with this book?
Yeah, and I so appreciate you saying that because, I wanted to write something that anyone could read, but I really despise when science and technology is sort of turned into kind of like a basic lecture, and I find it very patronizing for a lot of really intelligent people that just happen to not study at university. So I'm really happy to hear that you found it accessible. And yeah, completely echo what you said about it not being too overly simplified.
Yeah. So you start the book by saying there are two different kinds of hype. There's fair hype and there's problematic hype. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So I suppose to kind of go back even a further step, I think of hype as a tool. So I started the book more from the position that most people have around hype as seeing it as this really frustrating, annoying thing that kind of gets in the way of the truth and is used for companies, and they put adverts on our Twitter feed and it's really annoying and all this sort of thing, which is an understandable kind of way to look at hype. But when you start to think about it a little bit deeper, you realize that hype is essentially a tool in the same way that technology is a tool or advertising is a tool or any of these sorts of things. And hype is essentially a tool for getting messages across, for amplifying messages, for being heard, for cutting through. And that's sometimes really important. If you have to tell people, I don't know, to stay at home and not go outside, for instance, it's really important that you get these kind of narratives that people can latch on to, understand, and change their behavior accordingly. But then obviously from the sort of problematic hype side, this is where I suppose you have to make a distinction between fake news, misinformation, disinformation on one side and hype being on the other. So the sort of analogy I use here is part of the reason why the book is called Smoke and Mirrors is around magic. So if you go to a magic show, you are consenting to be fooled. So you walk in going, this magician is going to try and fool me, and that's okay. Whereas if you're being lied to, or misinformation, fake news, disinformation, I kind of think of that as non-consensual fooling. And so hype, it's more that when this tool is utilized, sometimes it can result in accidental fooling, where the person who receives the message might take out of context, the emotional words that are used might have a really strong impact on the person. And sometimes that can result in misinformation, or over exaggeration that's not, I guess it's not justified. So I suppose intent around the use of hype is kind of important, and you have to keep that in mind when you're sort of deciding whether or not hype is, the sort of the ends justify the means, shall we say.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the way this book works, you take us through some big areas of science and technology that people have a good general understanding of, or maybe they think they do, and you do quite a lot of myth busting around them. And you start the book by looking at agriculture, and you say that our food system is killing us, that there are 800 million people in the world living in hunger, and that we have a 20th century agricultural system that is not fit for the realities of the 21st century. How have we got to that?
Well, the way that I kind of thought about this chapter was around values and values that sit at centers of systems. So if you think about the agriculture system, what it's currently built on is trying to optimize for food production and therefore profit. And that doesn't take into account what kind of food, diversity of food, healthiness of food, production that doesn't kill the planet, production that is scalable over time. None of those sorts of kind of values are essentially prioritized when you look at the incentive structures in the industry and also the regulation around the industry. It's all geared towards creating lots of food. And so the problem here is that the system that we have right now actually, works very well if you're okay with the system being set up to just produce lots of food. But when you start thinking about the reality of the world that we're living in, where, I mean, we've all heard about, farming being one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases and to, issues with, aquaculture and, the killing the rainforests and all these sorts of things, alongside the fact that, I say there's 800 million people in hunger, but actually, if you also take a look at the idea of malnutrition, obesity is a arguably bigger problem than undernutrition, not having enough food. And also malnutrition in the sense of not getting good nutrients. There's a lot of places in the world where people live in food deserts in the United States, in Great Britain, where people don't have access to healthy, nutritious food. So, and also, we all know about the soil being ruined and all these sorts of things. So there's huge issues within the food system that still has this central value of, creating lots of food, but is massively damaging in so many other ways, and killing us in various different kind of ways, which I kind of go through, not just from hunger and from climate change, but also things like, for instance, farmer suicide is huge in places like India because of it's really uncertain when it comes to the amount that they're able to provide for their families and so on and so forth. So my argument is that in order to make the food system better, we have to redesign it with different values at the core, so that when you start creating incentive structures and laws and the way that money flows, you take into account things like, is this healthy? Or is this going to keep providing in 50 years' time? Or is this killing the environment? And so on and so forth, which is what it's not currently got at the core. If that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You go on to talk about the problems around cancer and how we talk about cancer. And you say that in 2019, an Israeli biotech company proclaimed itself that it found a cure for cancer and that it would be ready in about 12 months. You also say that that headline came from the lab itself as much as the journalist
Yeah.
reporting on it. How did that come about?
That's normal. I mean, journalists are not making stuff up. I mean, well, most of us aren't, journalists sometimes don't take the time to read beyond a press release, which is where sometimes you get these problems where they're not asking deeper questions, or a journalist is assigned to write about something that they don't have expertise on and don't have the time to go and learn about. There's nothing wrong with a journalist writing about something outside their beat if they get the time to go and research. But so what I think happened here is that the press release that came from the lab was regurgitated by the journalists, and it wasn't reported on a deep level. The big questions weren't asked. And what often happens, particularly with things like cancer, we're both journalists. Like, we know that headlines are, crafted to try and get people to click on things, and saying cure for cancer is obviously a huge emotional thing that gets people really excited, and particularly because the vast majority of people know someone or related to someone, or they themselves has been affected by cancer. So it's a difficult balance here, where you want to be able to report on interesting new developments, which, I mean, the Israeli team were hugely exaggerating. The 12-month thing was an absolute joke. But they had come up with a new interesting piece of science that possibly, if more questions had been asked and it had looked at a bit deeper, could have been a really interesting story in and of itself, and important for the development of treatment in cancer. But because it was kind of reported on with a sort of breathless, we're going to cure cancer in a year, which it got debunked within like a day. It just was not true. The exaggeration was so far reaching. And so I think it's kind of one of the things I thought a lot about this book is, who do we blame for this? And the people that tend to kind of get blamed for this is journalists, and rightly so sometimes, by the way. The media's not got a great track record in terms of exaggerating things for the purpose of clicks or for the purpose of advertising slots or whatever. And we all know why, right? Is business models don't quite work. But equally, they have to get their information from somewhere. And we also have a responsibility as individuals reading that information to not just, believe things at face value and not employ a little bit of critical thinking. I mean, reading something that says we're going to cure cancer in a year, I think anyone who reads that and doesn't go, really, needs to rethink how they kind of approach headlines. And that's all a sort of civic duty. I think in the same way that we all get encouraged to vote, we should be encouraged to critically think around what we read and what we see. And that doesn't mean every time you read a headline you have to go to the library and take out 10 books to try and educate yourself on the intricacies of cancer. But at the same time, I do think that taking things at face value and forgetting that headlines are there to simply grab attention, they're not the full story. You take it as a full story, then that's problematic too. But and then obviously the lab as well. The lab has a responsibility to effectively communicate what they're doing to journalists and not prioritize getting the story over telling the wrong story. And I think that's something that I talk a lot to businesses, small businesses, particular startups and labs as well, as they're sort of saying, how can I get a piece in Wired to make my research, and how can I do this, that, and the other? And I'm saying, well, do you need that? Like, genuinely, is it for an ego perspective that you want the story, or is the story right now the thing that the media should be reporting on? Is it genuinely that groundbreaking right this second? And I think a lot of people that are building this stuff can get quite caught up in what they're doing, which is understandable, and they need to be caught up in order to move things forward. But at the same time, there's a lack of critical thinking from their perspective of, well, what could go wrong if this narrative blows up, if a whole load of hype comes around this? What sort of detrimental narratives will be through society as a result? So there's responsibility at sort of all levels, and hype only propagates when people share it, believe it, tell their friends. It's a collective thing, right? And with smoke and mirrors, I don't want to put blame on anyone. I'm trying to give people the tools to kind of, I don't know, be able to feel more comfortable in reading a headline and going, okay, how do I actually work out whether or not that's real or not, and what's the context around why this headline's even got to me in the first place. So yeah, so it was quite a long-winded answer, but I suppose that's the question was around whose responsibility is it, and frankly, I think it's everyone's.
So I think the other thing that really struck me about the cancer section as well is you taking issue with this language that we often use around cancer. It's a battle to be won, and if people die prematurely, they've lost their battle with it. Do you think that needs to be challenged? Because it seems like quite a simplified and potentially damaging way of talking about cancer,
Yeah.
but we've just taken for granted that that's how we do it, haven't we?
Yeah, definitely. There's actually quite a lot of research in this sort of area of like battle narratives around cancer and the effect it has on patients as well as the public. So if you were to let's take the public to begin with. So battle narratives are really quite good and effective in terms of the public because it gets people hopeful and driven, and yes, I'm going to donate to Cancer Research UK because we're all in this together. And these kind of, I mean, you're seeing these narratives right now with coronavirus, people saying we're going to fight the virus and all these sorts of things. It's kind of a collective, bringing people together kind of way of thinking about things. So it's effective in terms of getting public support, whether that's, as I say, donating to charities or voting in politicians that want to focus on cancer. Or getting through a new bill, or getting people to accept that things are going to cost a lot of money and their tax might go up. It's a really good way of essentially getting people on board. But from a sort of more negative side, it means that the public sometimes be quite unquestioning. Because if you say we're all in this together, it's a battle, and you go, well, hang on a second, like, are we doing it the right way? That's quite a taboo question to ask when we're meant to all be together fighting this thing that we all know is bad. So it's a little bit blinkering. When you look at it from the patient perspective, so some patients find it really empowering, this idea of battling, the cancer that's within them. It gives them a lot of strength, and particularly, obviously, at some of the most difficult points in their life, or possibly maybe at the end of their life, it can be a really empowering thing that helps mental health and all these sorts of things. But on the other side, it can be an extremely damaging narrative for patients because it can essentially put responsibility onto the patient. So they can feel like, oh, I'm not fighting hard enough. Or even, there was a brilliant piece in The Guardian, which I cite in the book, where a woman who had cancer at the time, who then died, a year later, a couple months later, she said, I don't want to be thought of as having lost my battle with cancer. I don't want to be spoken about in that way. I've fought really hard, but at the end of the day, I have no control of this. And this is an illness, not not a career. So it can be really, really damaging and cause a lot of issues, particularly also when it comes to having patients sometimes fight too hard. And what I mean by that is, if a doctor's saying, look, this isn't going to work, they get a second opinion, the doctor says this isn't going to work, they go for a third opinion, the doctor goes, this isn't going to work, I'm really sorry. And then you end up having patients going out of the sort of scientific medical system and going into, so-called alternative medicines. I wouldn't call them alternative medicines because they're not official medicines, but taking alternative approaches to their care. And we've got so many examples of when people have had really, really difficult times of it at the end of their lives as a result of this kind of distrust in the system. So, and everyone each to their own, but I think that when we use narratives that essentially blind people or stop people from thinking a little bit deeper, you could argue that that's not choice. Subliminal advertising is illegal for a reason, because it takes away the choice. You're being, marketed to in a way that you're not deciding that, yes, I've seen this advert, I'd like to now go buy this thing. It's been put in your brain and you do it without thinking. So you could argue that sometimes if a narrative is very, very strong and people adopt it really, really strongly, it's not actually patient choice. It's closer to, it's a strong word, but it's closer to sort of a brainwashing kind of feel. So we have to be very careful with these narratives and how it can push people to do things that might not necessarily be in their benefit, and also is not allowing them to have choice and not allowing people to ask questions, not allowing people to be critical. So that, and I think as well, it also links into one of the things I kind of talk about a little in the chapter, is the sort of, in certain cultures, not all cultures, but particularly Western cultures, the taboo nature of talking about death. This is another thing that's talked about a lot, that we, particularly here in Britain, are very uncomfortable talking about death, uncomfortable talking about wills and funerals. And it's a huge issue because it means so many people don't write a will, and then families lose a lot of money, they have a lot of stress, all this sort of thing. And a lot of it is down to the fact that people just don't want to think about it. And I think it's the same when you start talking about, should the NHS invest a whole load of money on a treatment that's only going to give someone 2 months extra, but it's going to stop us from investing in something that will give life to 500 people. And then you have to have really difficult conversations about value of human life and all these sorts of things. So I kind of argue that we need to kind of rethink how we approach this idea of even just battling end of life. You hear a lot of the discussion in sort of transhumanist areas where it's, this idea that death is something that we should absolutely fight, and that aging is a disease and all that sort of thing. And, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I do think that it's based on an assumption that we are not capable of accepting end of life. So there's lots of kind of things that are really difficult to talk about in cancer and taboo to talk about around cancer. And it doesn't mean that I'm not supportive of spending lots of money to try and find treatments, of course not. But I do think that deeper questions need to be asked so that we're not blinkered into believing things that are not true, like the Israeli paper.
Yeah. So let's just talk about kind of the overhyped headlines and how they affect what science and technology gets invested in, because that's one of the things that I found the most fascinating about this book. It really does affect what money, burgeoning companies and established ones can get for their scientific investigations, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%. When you think about, we vote in politicians, and politicians make decisions about the budget that the science and technology sector gets every single year. And I think sometimes we get the feeling that like venture capital and private companies and corporations have more control and are doing more and what make more decisions around science tech. But it's not the case. Like the amount of investment that comes from government into science and tech versus private corporation it's not even remotely comparable. It's huge amounts of money come from government, particularly when it comes to earlier forms of development of science and tech. So, how we vote and how the public feel has a huge impact on literally on the money that goes to scientists. That's part of the reason actually cancer is it, in terms of the amount of money that's out there. If you compare it to other diseases and other focuses, you could argue that it's overfunded. But a lot of that has to do with because public sentiment is, well, cancer is more important than lots of other things, which, that's everyone has their own opinion on that. I would probably agree it is more important than a lot of other things. But I don't think people kind of realize that they actually have quite a lot of power, voting power and campaigning power when it comes to science and tech, especially people who didn't study it. You can sort of be like, well, I don't know anything about this. The people with the lab coats are on TV. They've done this new thing. Okay, I have nothing I say or do has anything to do with that. And it's so not the case. You've got to remember that people who are in these funding committees and whatnot are regular people as well. Like, they read the same news that we do. They see what's on the television. They see the narratives coming out of science and tech. Yes, okay, they're probably doing a lot more reading than the regular person, but at the same time, they're still going to be affected by public sentiment. And that's kind of one of the arguments I wanted to make in the book, is that, you know, I think a lot of people feel quite disempowered with science and tech, not just from a perspective of not feeling like they understand it or get it or have a place in having an opinion on it, but also that they as individuals in society, it's this thing that just doesn't, they have no say in. They can't change the laws, they can't change the funding. And I wanted to make the point that it is all linked, that narratives are, I mean, God, the pen is mightier than the sword. Like, we know that words matter and that words are important. I just think a lot of people don't link that to science and tech, and I really, really hope the Smoke and Mirrors kind of changes minds in some respect.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. So I want to move on a bit to kind of when you start talking about space in the book, because for me, this was one of the most fascinating sections. I think everyone has a lot of preconceptions about what they think is going on in terms of the expansion of humans into space, this idea that we could live in space permanently, that we could mine space, all these kinds of things. You say
Yeah.
that the press coverage of space is either about the cult of the entrepreneur investing in space or science fiction becoming reality. So,
Yeah.
what should it be about instead?
Yeah. I think it should be covering the reality of what the space sector actually is, as opposed to what it says about itself or what the far future of it is. And I think the reason that a lot of people probably find that quite a weird thing to say is they go, but yeah, space is not really happening right now. Like, we're not living on Mars right now. There's not a space hotel we can go to right now. We're not mining stuff in space right now. And it's like, yeah, but there's tons of stuff going on currently that impact that in the future. And like the satellites, for instance, the satellite industry is absolutely humongous. And the people that kind of get the breathless coverage, the sort of Elon Musk's, for instance, their business at the moment works and makes money because they take satellites or they build satellites in space. So I think part of the argument that I wanted to make in this chapter is that we kind of see space as this thing that isn't a current human industry, and it's this future utopian thing that we're trying to aspire to. And I'm like, no, it's just a normal industry, the same as any other industry. It's an industry in the same way that the retail industry is an industry, or the oil industry is an industry, or the food industry is an industry. And you can take food, retail, oil, and talk about the pros and cons of those industries. And often with space, we don't look at it in that sort of same realm. Like, okay, who has power? What's the economic models in here? What do the laws look like? Who are the influential companies and the influential people? What does the public think of it? All these normal questions that we ask about other industries. It's like space kind of has a bit of a pass because it's this cool, awesome, thing that it's a sort of mission-driven thing. When really it's not. It's just a normal industry that happens to have an interesting vision in the far future, but it still has to function right now, and it's still got the same problems that any human industry has, because at the end of the day, humans run it and we're not perfect. So I really hope that we can start to shift some of the narratives into, okay, well, what's wrong with this industry now? And therefore, how can we make it better? How can we talk about problematic power structures? How can we talk about the fact that, Luxembourg has created essentially a space haven in the same way it's created a tax haven, where it's essentially encouraging a lot of small companies to come, giving them huge benefits, huge amount of initial power. What's that going to mean for that country in a couple of years' time versus all other countries? What are we talking about? Space sustainability? Like, space junk is a humongous problem, humongous, and nobody's really trying to fix it right now. There's lots of ideas, there's lots of small companies, but there's no international big effort to try and clean up what we have above our heads. So it's not, I don't want to come across and be like, space is terrible and we're all completely blinkered and we don't understand, but rather I just think we don't have a realistic picture of what's really going on. In fact, and frankly, it's really fascinating. It's a fascinating industry. If you're the sort of person that finds systems interesting, or you enjoy like long reads that you read in the Guardian about a strange, weird company over here, whatever, you will love the space industry. There's lots of characters, weird business models. As I say, different countries doing lots of different weird and wonderful things. It's fascinating. But instead, we've got this breathless kind of Elon Musk is going to take us to Mars, or Elon Musk has announced that he's going to go to the moon, or Elon Musk has done this, or Jeff Bezos has done this, and you're kind of like, it's just not it's not the reality of what's really going on, and it keeps people again not asking questions. Kind of almost, it's like putting the public in a sort of box and saying, you guys just be excited about this stuff. Don't worry about what's actually going on. So it's kind of a patronizing narrative too. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'd like to see change.
So one of the things that you did say about space, which I suppose I just never thought about it, was that there are no real space laws yet.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can you tell us something about that? Because that really blew my mind when I read about it.
I know. This is what I mean about it being really fascinating. Like, it's so much stuff that is happening in these sort of deep tech areas is completely most people think is kind of mental when you say outside of the sort of circles we're in. So yeah, the space law. So in the 1960s, there was a big sort of international treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, that was a sort of UN effort that lots of countries signed, not everyone, but lots of countries signed. And it was basically saying, like, you know, we're not having nuclear weapons in space, and, you know, we can't, no one can own anything in space. It's kind of like Antarctica or the ocean floor, where it's kind of like this neutral space. And space, huh? With the chapter, I had to stop using the word space to mean area. Anyway, so it's got this 1960s treaty, which frankly just hasn't really been updated. So there's not been anything since then that kind of cements internationally how everyone's going to act. It's also a guideline. So it's not, you know, you aren't breaking some kind of international convention if you do something like that in space. And in fact, there's been examples of countries that have done things that are against those guidelines, and it doesn't really, nothing's been done about it. Individual countries can have laws. So like the US had, you know, Obama put in a law that basically said if an American person or company mined an asteroid, they would get to own it, which is completely against the Outer Space Treaty. And it just happened, got written into law, and now Americans can go into space and take stuff and claim it as their own based on American law. But the problem is with space is that it's not, you know, laws are it's very difficult to, it's a whole different thing between international law and national law, where you international jurisdiction is quite hard because you have all these different countries that you have to agree on certain things. Also difficult, like say for instance, if say for instance we have a space hotel, right? And all different countries have contributed to building the space hotel in the same way that the International Space Station has got like a Russian part, a Belgian part, a UK part, an American part. It's got all different parts from all different Japanese, whatever. Say for instance there's a space hotel that has the same sort of setup. Say you're in the, I don't know, the Japanese wing of the space hotel, and a German murders someone from Australia. Under which jurisdiction does that murder be tried? Is it tried in space with like new international space laws, which we don't currently have? Or do we come down to Germany, the nationality of the person who did it, or is it Australia because it's the person who is the victim, or indeed is it in Japan because it was technically kind of like on their land, if that makes sense, because it's what they built. So there's all these like kind of intriguing questions, which seem again a little bit far future, but when you bring it back to the present around, okay, well, if a satellite crashes into another satellite, which happens right now, that could happen any second, whose fault is it? Is it the country from where the satellite's from? It was launched, or is it the country in which the company is registered, which could be different from where it was launched? Or is it indeed, the country from where the other satellite was launched, or the country where the company, the other side, so there's like all these kind of difficult to answer questions around liability, around fairness, around simple structures, that we're in this sort of tragedy of the commons, where no country wants to kind of lay down a whole load of laws that might put them at a disadvantage. So launching laws, for instance, in this final thing I was like, I know not everyone is quite as fascinated as law as I am, but launching laws are really interesting where, to be responsible, you should say that if you launch a satellite, you have to have a plan for bringing it down out of orbit when it's finished its mission, because otherwise it just stays up there as space junk. So that's seems like quite a reasonable thing to say. If you're going to launch from Britain, you also have to submit your deployment plan for when it becomes inactive, right? That seems pretty reasonable. Some countries have that and some countries don't. And so if you're a small company that doesn't have very much money, or maybe you have money but you don't want to spend it, and it's going to cost you money to write up these plans, make them real, build the tech to deploy, and you go, we're not going to spend that. You're just going to go to a country that doesn't have that, doesn't ask for that as part of your launch plan. And so the country that doesn't ask for that then gains tax by you going and launching from them. You're paying them to launch. So it's beneficial for them to make it easy for companies that come to launch because they can benefit. But then the country that's being more responsible loses money because they're not getting the same amount of people coming, but they're actually being more responsible. So again, it's this whole kind of like incentive structures, and nobody really wants to be the first one to do stuff because they will lose out versus others that will be more competitive. So space law is fascinating because it basically deals with like sort of, shall we say, petty human stuff that we all want to win and we all want to be individualistic and we're not trying to work together. So it's an intriguing space to follow. I'd recommend keeping your eye on it. There's always stuff happening in the sort of space law space.
Yeah, I just never thought about any of this stuff, and then I was like, wow, there's so much to consider. I think the other thing is it feels like we get the space that we deserve. So if we don't think enough about how we live morally on Earth, we're not going to think about that when it comes to space, are we? But potentially we've got a new chance to improve what we're already doing on Earth.
Exactly. And that's precisely kind of the point I'm always trying to make with hype, is that a lot of time hype surrounds this like far future. I mean, like, AI is going to do that. Robots are going to take all of our jobs. Right? That's quite a far future thing. Some people are being replaced right now, but all of our jobs, far future. We're going to cure cancer, far future. We're going to live in space, far future. And so it gets people thinking about these interesting kind of philosophical questions if they go a little bit deeper. Say the AI one, should AI have rights? And how does an AI make a decision who to kill? The trolley problem when they're in a car crash. All these kind of questions that are sort of philosophically and ethically interesting, but it kind of keeps you from looking at what's happening right now. It totally distracts you. And when you kind of, I suppose, remove the hype blinkers and remove the future blinkers, it's not difficult to suddenly see what's right in front of you. So if you look at AI, the example I always use is robots are going to steal your job, which is a far future narrative, gets you thinking about all this philosophical stuff. But if you reframe it to the present and you say corporate executives are making decisions to replace human labor with mechanical machines in the name of profit, I'm not saying that's bad or good, although I have my opinion on that, as most people probably do. But what it does is it immediately brings you back to asking questions about the present. Should we have universal basic income? What does it look like in terms of tax? How do we reskill? What do we think about corporate power? These are all interesting but important immediate questions that more people need to be thinking about. And exactly as you say, like, we get what we deserve if we're not, as a collective, as society, paying attention to this. It might not end up being what you want, but you have to take part in order to if you don't vote, you don't get to complain about who's in power, right?
Right, exactly. Well, okay, this is just so fascinating, and it's brilliant talking to you about it because you're adding so much colour to the stuff that I've read. I'm going to ask the audience if they want to ask Gemma any questions now. We'll find out if the chat function is working. So if you've got any questions for Gemma whatsoever, they can be about, obviously, the book, about her knowledge more broadly, about any of the issues that we've talked about so far, then please drop us a question. I'm just going to ask you another question that I sort of thought about, Gemma, and I think about this in terms of me being a journalist and working some of the time in PR as well. I think you're extremely generous in not laying the blame immediately at the door of these conduits of communication is probably the best way of putting it. Why was it so important for you to kind of not go down that track with this book?
Sort of two reasons. First of all, the book is aimed at a general audience, and I wanted it to be useful, and I wanted it to be something that people could do something with, and kind of feel empowered by. If it was a book that just blamed media, you just have people being angry at media, and there's that's a fair thing to feel in many ways. I'm angry at the Daily Mail. God, that piece this morning about Keir Starmer was a joke. So there's reasons to be angry with media or certain parts of the media or whatever all the time. But writing a book that's just attacking the media, personally, I don't think is really adding that much. We already have tons of books that do that, even within the science and tech space, to some degree. But because I wanted it to be empowering, but also because I feel that whilst there are many decisions made when it comes to communicating things that result in bad outcomes when it comes to hype, it doesn't take a genius to be like, well, we understand why they've used that headline because it gets people to click. And that might not seem like a reasonable, fair kind of excuse. But at the same time, we're also very aware of the fact that the media industry is dying at the moment. There's, I think it's now 8 PRs for every journalist in the world, which I think is crazy and very, very damaging if we think about the fact that most PRs are hired by corporations. And if there's more of them than journalists, how on earth are we going to hold power to account? And I say that as someone who does, the same as you, most freelancers have to do some form of corporate work in order to pay your London rent. But that is a problem. And so I think it's about trying to see the context in which messages are put out into the world. And, I've done a lot of talks for journalists and for media organizations, and also for scientists who are looking to move into science communication about the ideas in my book. And when I'm talking about that, I go really hard on sort of personal responsibility. I just think for the book itself, I wanted it to be, we talk a lot about like getting ideas out. Are books even the best way to get certain ideas out? Is a YouTube video better? Is a talk like this better? A discussion, all that sort of thing. And I think for the book, I wanted to make the point that we all can do something like this and we can be empowered, and then do some workshops on the side that go, hello, media, don't do this, you jackasses. and also myself, have a lot of harsh conversations with myself about what does personal responsibility mean to me. I do some work with Forbes, and I was on the tube a couple of months ago, and I saw a startup advert in like Shoreditch. I think it was an Old Street station where most of their ads are startups, and it was like just a picture of like an app, a phone with the app, I think, and at the top it just said like astounding Forbes. And I thought, God, if I write an article and I just happen to put the word astounding in it, and a startup can use that to essentially put on a thing in the middle of Old Street Station, like it really maybe it reminds me constantly of the responsibility I have as a writer to make sure that these words are going to be used somehow, and what might that usage be, and how can I sort of safeguard against it. So I suppose that's why I made it about personal responsibility. I tried to make people reflect on it themselves, as opposed to just saying these companies make no sense. Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah. Oh, so we've got a question here. This is from my friend Bob. He says, can getting the communications wrong actually halt the progress of science?
Yeah, definitely. In many different kinds of ways, actually. So I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is in the fusion energy space, where dominant narratives around fusion is that it's 50 years away, it's never going to be a thing, or it relates to pseudoscience, so people get kind of confused between fusion and cold fusion, or it relates to nuclear waste, which is a misunderstanding between fusion and fission. Fission is what we currently have, fusion is a future technology. And so getting the comms wrong about fusion has basically made a lot of people distrust this technology, or think it's not a thing, or don't pay attention, and all that sort of stuff. So essentially got a lack of hype, if you will, or the wrong kind of hype maybe. Which means that, and I argue this in I have a whole chapter in fusion, it means that the focus on this technology has been reduced from a governmental perspective, from a funding perspective, and also from a private sector perspective. And you could argue that the development of the technology has been slowed as a result. It also means that there's going to be some big news around fusion in about 4 or 5 years' time, because the biggest experiment in the world that no one's heard of in the south of France, called ITER, is turning on, and it turns on in 2025, and is basically going to try and prove that fusion can be done. It's a science experiment, no, we're not going to have free energy tomorrow. And I worry about the fact that the media will probably cover it like that around the time, and then everyone will be disappointed again, and the cycle continues. So here's a kind of perfect example of where development of a technology and trust in a technology and money and all that sort of thing gets reduced because people just simply don't realize that it's actually quite good or quite interesting or worth paying attention to. And then another example would be I would actually give VR as an example. I think VR has been hugely overhyped, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we now have devices that we do, and that we do actually have investment in the space. Medical separate, let's put medical to one side. Medical VR is got a very different kind of purpose, but consumer VR, I think the interest and the money and all that's gone into VR has been as a result of hype. A couple of years ago, when it was rubbish, it wasn't a good technology, and it's still trying to work out, like, what's the business model of this? How do we make it scalable? How do people actually use it? Do people even like it? I mean, God, I feel car sick every time I put on a VR headset, which is a huge problem for a lot of people. So I think sometimes what can happen with hype is you create a self-fulfilling prophecy around a technology that doesn't really, don't have the right word for it, but doesn't really maybe deserve the hype. And it's almost like you bring it into existence through narrative, as opposed to it actually being useful for society, actually working, actually making sense, actually having a good business model, all those sorts of things. So hype can be very powerful, as well then as like an opportunity cost, so investing in VR, but what wasn't invested instead of that, where did that money go? We all have the same, money's used for everything. It's all the same thing. Yeah. So what's the opportunity cost? So those are the two kind of, I guess, examples to kind of show about this idea of getting the comms wrong can slow development.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question. Are citizens' assemblies a better way of deciding priorities?
Sometimes. I think one of the things I try to talk about in the book, just as a quick side note, is sort of absolutist narratives and nuance. And I think sometimes you can't answer a question with a yes or a no. You have to say it depends, which nobody really likes. But fence sitters unite. I think that we're too caught up in this idea of having to take a side sometimes, and that can be problematic in and of itself. But citizen assemblies, I think for certain things, yes. I think when it comes to, shall we say, more moralistic discussions and things that kind of have a more immediate effect on people, yes, but at the same time you can slow things by having too many opinions as well. So I think the difficulty here is that at the moment the few that are making decisions, quite a lot of people would argue, is not reflective of society, right? Predominantly men, predominantly white, predominantly wealthy, predominantly Westerners, all that sort of thing, which is a problem. But at the same time, it's like, how do you effectively create a citizen assembly that is definitely reflective of society and is not just keen people? And in science and tech, a lot of the issue around hype is that we have a lot of techno-utopianism and a lot of people that are just very pro-tech and aren't thinking deeper. So if you ask for a sitting assembly on AI, you had a whole load of techies that are really interested, then it's not really going to do much different, I think, than having people in power. So it's like, how do you actually create something that's useful and is able to make decisions that are quick and reflective and all that sort of thing? So my question back to the person asking the question, and maybe you can tweet me or we can talk about it in our time, is how would you build an effective citizen assembly that is going to be more moralistic than what we already have in power?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Oh, we've got another comment here from Maya. She says it's an excellent talk. How can we cultivate society to develop more critical thinking? I think that's a brilliant question because it's something that I didn't really come onto at the end. The conclusion of the book really is that we've got to cultivate our own critical thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
So
it's a difficult one because it's hard, because in some sense I wish I could say you can teach it and here's a course that you can go learn and we should put it in all schools and everyone should have to pass it in the same way you have to pass a driving test before you're allowed to, I don't know, do anything. Of course, first of all, that's a little bit authoritarian, but also teaching critical thinking is quite hard because critical thinking is not a checklist. And I make this point in the conclusion where I sort of say, if I was to write a checklist for critical thinking, here are 9 steps I would have, and I'll give you a few examples in a minute. But the 10th point on my 10-step plan is don't ever follow a list, because critical thinking is about thinking for yourself and about asking your own questions and navigating things. People who are kind of active or good critical thinkers, they see a sort of tsunami of information, like, what do I think about AI, right? That's like, oh God, where do I begin? There's this tsunami of information to begin. And they sort of jump in their little dinghy, their little blow up dinghy with their paddle that's probably going to snap. And they sort of jump in and go, all right, let's give this a go. And they start paddling furiously, trying to make sense of, what do I think about AI? Whereas people that are not quite as comfortable critically thinking tend to kind of, that's scary. And like, oh, I don't have the ability to do this. I don't get it. It's not my place to ask questions and all that sort of thing. And so critical thinking is less about, I guess, steps, but more encouraging empowerment and showing people that like being wrong is okay, and asking, there's no such thing as a silly question, genuinely. And, every single person has a right to have an opinion on these things. And if they're going to argue that opinion in a big public sphere, they also kind of have to give evidence and show why they've come to that in order to encourage other people to believe them. So the sort of steps I guess I give is to try and help people when they come up against a headline and go, oh God, I don't even know what to think, which is simple things like, for instance, just pause, consider that there's been emotional language used in it that's caught your attention. What is that emotional language? Why is it making you feel a certain thing? And then put it to the side and then go, okay, what's this article actually talking about? Or what's this piece of information actually telling me? Ask questions like, who wrote it? What kind of bias are they likely to have, good and bad? And it's not about not believing stuff, it's just about understanding the context in which a message exists in the world. So if it's come from a professor, what university are they at? What kind of funding do they have? If it's a journalist, what kind of newspaper is this? What other things have they written? If it's a CEO of a company, well, what company is it? Simple things. And again, it's not about saying what they're saying is wrong, it's just understanding the context. Other stuff like, how do you build a system around an idea? So if you're talking about something like AI, how do you essentially put yourself in different people's shoes to essentially look at the scenarios in which an idea exists? So say it's robots are going to steal our jobs. Well, what does that mean to me, right? Well, I'm a writer, so would a robot steal my job? Well, I guess in some sense, and then, okay, let's put it into the shoes of my dad, who's a stonemason. Maybe a robot could steal the carving stuff, but I don't think he could build a ruble wall because there's quite a lot of uncertainty there and difficult to kind of pick up stones. Put it in my gran. My gran still doesn't have a job, but maybe an AI could help look after her. A robot could help, so it's just about, and what about someone 50 years in the future? What about someone in a different country? What about someone who's younger than me? You can build scenarios quite quickly by just putting yourself in other people's shoes. And another way of doing that as well, the final thing I'll say is also try and take the science and technology out of science and technology. So go, what does this mean for society? What does this mean for law? What does it mean for economics? What does it mean for politics? What does it mean for the poorest in society? And what does it mean for the wealthiest in society? Every single person is going to have a different angle to look at things through. And that's really powerful. It's not about going, I don't have a nuclear physics PhD, so I can't have an opinion on quantum computing. It's going, is quantum computing going to be relevant for me? And instead of just dismissing it immediately, going, well, actually, let's have a little think about this. You might come to the answer that's no, that's fine. You might just find it interesting. This is one of the big fallacies, I think, when we talk about science communication. Science communicators are always told to make it relevant to the individual. Not all science and tech is immediately, I can't say how quantum computing is going to change your commute, but I can tell you why it's interesting, and I can tell you why you should have an opinion on it and why it affects society as a whole. So again, it's having these little moments of pause, these little moments of like personal exploration. If you want to go further, go to the library. If you don't, that's fine. And also don't retweet stuff that you don't understand. Simple as that.
Yep.
And that's not saying don't retweet anything. It's like, just read the whole article. Just don't only read the headline. Read the whole article and then retweet it.
I think that's
or
a really
say,
good
I don't
life
understand
lesson.
this. Does anyone understand this? I'd love to learn more. It's small things that I think everyone can do that helps the headlines. But in terms of critical thinking, it's more about empowering yourself and feeling like, I do want to learn about this, or I can learn about this, or this is interesting. I want to work out a bit more about it. And asking questions.
Okay, amazing. Well, we've come to the end. God, that's gone so quickly.
Already? God, that flew.
It's absolutely flown. So, viewers, we just want to say Gemma's wonderful book, Smoke and Mirrors, is out now. Gemma, do you have the cover so we could have a little peek?
I do.
There we go. It's
right
absolutely
here.
fabulous. I read it so quickly. I can't recommend it enough. So, you can buy that today from the Also Digital bookshop, which is on the Also Digital site. And please buy it from us because it's just better for the book industry. Gemma, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you get a chance to maybe look around the festival later today. And
Yeah,
thanks for
definitely.
coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate it. And thank you
You're
guys all for
welcome.
your questions.
Take care. Are we done?